Adam here from Northwest Slackline, and welcome to part 4 of our guide to longlining. This is probably going to be the longest one because it's the part on rigging. Before we get started, I just want to cover a couple pieces of hardware that are going to keep showing up and make sure we have the terminology straight. So this is a steel carabiner. Probably you're familiar with carabiners if you're slacklining. Because it's steel, it's much stronger, but still we want to check the rating on it and make sure. This one's rated to 53 kilonewtons. It's hard for me to think in kilonewtons, but 44 kilonewtons is 10,000 pounds. So that's sort of one benchmark that I always keep in my mind. So anything over that is probably pretty darn strong. Another piece of hardware that people sometimes use is quick links. I don't like quick links, mostly because they're only strong, just like a carabiner, when they're closed. You know, this is not 53 kilonewtons strong, now it is. And so with a quick link, it's not particularly strong unless you make sure it's closed, and it's hard to remember to always close them because it's a tedious, time-consuming thing, and sometimes they come open on their own. So if you're going to use a quick link, I would only use them in places where they're going to stay there permanently and you tape them shut so you know they're not coming open, which is why I only own one, because I just use it on the becket of my pulleys. The other thing to talk about is shackles. Again, at this point we know what they are, but in the video where I did show shackles, I didn't show anything other than a safety bolt shackle. This is a screw pin type shackle. I don't particularly like these, but you can buy them if you want. This is a no-name Chinese one. Those are bad because I don't think we can trust them. The orange ones that I use are made by Columbus McKinnon, CM, and you can find them all over the internet if you look around. There are several registered dealers in the United States. Crosby is another reputable name for shackles. They're another American brand. Or Van Beest is a Dutch brand that a lot of people use. I just like the Columbus McKinnon ones because they're strong, they're easy to find in the safety bolt version, and they work quite well. So now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about mechanical advantage, which is what this whole segment is actually going to be about. I have here in my hands a couple of different pulleys. There are different ways to get lines tight. Pulleys are by no means the only way to do that. Some people use chain hoists. I've heard of people using come-alongs. But for the purpose of this video, we're really going to talk about pulleys. Pulleys are sort of the tried and true, and I would say safest and easiest way to do it. There might be safer ways, but they weigh hundreds of pounds and cost thousands and thousands of dollars. Or there might be easier ways, but again, the same thing is true. So pulleys are great. Because they're fairly cheap, they're fairly strong, they're easy to carry around, and they're fairly easy to understand and to work with. The main thing you need to know about a pulley, there are really only 3 things to know. So first of all, the sheave size of the pulley is important. So this is the sheave, the thing that rolls, that the rope goes on. And so you can see this is like a 1-inch sheave here, maybe not even quite 1 inch. This is a 3-inch sheave, and I think this is 2.5 or 2 3/4. The bigger the sheave, the more efficient the pulley is going to be. Additionally, the sheave itself is going to rotate around either a bushing or a bearing. Sealed ball bearings are more efficient than bushings, but they're also more expensive. And then lastly, we need to begin to understand how the mechanical advantage of pulleys actually adds up. So to do that, I'm going to rig a simple long line using a set of double SMC pulleys. This is going to be a 5-to-1 line, and basically the majority of this video is going to be geared towards rigging lines up to 100 meters long. Once you've been walking those lines for a while, you should understand enough about rigging and how all this gear works that you're probably not going to need a video to tell you how to go much beyond that. But towards the end of the video, we'll talk about what sort of adaptations do you need to make to your setup in order to do 200 or 300 meter lines. So we're going to rig a simple long line using some SMC double pulleys.
That's more hongo right there.
So you can see I've connected a Kofi with just a plain steel carabiner to the SMC double pulley. If you use an AWL from Balance Community, you can just clip that in place, the SMC pulley right onto their shackle, and you don't need the extra hardware in the middle here. The other thing we're going to need is some rope, specifically some static rope. So here I have a short length of static rope. Ultimately, this is not going to be enough for our needs. to rig any sort of real long line, but it'll be easier to thread everything and show you if I just use the short piece. So I've tied one end in a figure 8 and I just put a piece of webbing on there to help protect it, and the knot comes out a little easier as well with webbing, I find. And then I've got our quick link in place on the bracket already. And I'm just going to slide the knot on there. So there's the knot, now it's in place. So the best way to understand pulleys is just to sort of begin to break down the mechanical advantage. So if I didn't use the pulley at all, other than as just a webbing attachment device, and I pull on it right now, I have 1-to-1 advantage, right? So if I pull 50 pounds of force, the line is going to have 50 pounds of force on it. There's no multiplication or addition of my advantage. It's just, you know, what it is what it is. So if, on the other hand, I was to take the end of the pulley, or I was to take the end of the rope and run it through a pulley, and so now I'm going to pull in the opposite direction, that will double my advantage. That will make it 2-to-1. So we'll just run the end of the rope right up through this pulley real quick. And now you can see I'm actually getting twice as much advantage as I would normally get. So when I pull on this with 50 pounds, I get, you know, theoretically 100 pounds on the line. It's actually not quite 100 pounds because there's frictional losses and the advantage of the sheave size, and there are other factors in there. But in theory, at least, it's a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage. So I'm just going to go ahead and close up the quick link real quick, and then normally I would tape it shut. That's really important. All right, so again, if we repeat the process, we can thread, I'm going to thread this line down through the other pulley. And now we have a 3-to-1. So the way I think about it is you have whatever number of sheaves plus 1 if you're pulling in the direction that you were originally pulling when you were getting a 1-to-1 mechanical advantage. So let's just continue to extend that. So I'm going to find the end of the rope real quick, and then we'll feed that up through the anchor side pulley, and then down through the webbing side pulley, and then I'm going to step over the line and just go ahead and pull all the slack through so you can see how this comes together. And there's our 5-to-1 pulley system, which you can see I've set it up so that the gap will actually completely close. The figure 8 knot is actually hitting the becket on the anchor side pulley. I just want it all to be in the shot quite nicely so you can see it all. So this is a 5-to-1 mechanical advantage. And you can go beyond this. You can make a 9-to-1, which we'll talk about later, if you stack another set of double pulleys along the side. So hopefully at this point this makes sense. There are really sort of 2 major concepts to cover beyond this. So the next logical concept is, if this gives me 5-to-1 advantage, you know, I pull it and I get 5 times, theoretically anyway, I get 5 times the amount of force that I'm pulling. What are we going to do to keep that force there? Because as soon as I let go, all the tension pops out, right? So what we need to do is implement some sort of a brake. In this case, this is a gree-gree. If you're familiar with rock climbing, you know what a gree-gree is. There are lots of different brakes on the market. The gree-gree was the first sort of really popular long line brake, although I think there are better ones available now that are more sort of industrial or rescue oriented. And the patent on the gree-gree actually just expired, so there are a lot of interesting brakes hitting the market now beyond just the gree-gree. So we have to have enough tension for the gree-gree to actually want to grab, but as soon as we do, you can see the gree-gree holds the tension. So I can pull the line nice and taut, and tension holds. And then when it's time to release the tension, you just release it same way you would if you were belaying someone using a gree-gree. Of course, this is sort of comical if you've rigged a long line before. When you watch me do this, you know it's comical because there's no real tension on the line right now. But in theory, that's basically how all of this works. In a little while, we'll get to rigging a real long line with real tensions, and then we'll talk about why a gree-gree may not be so good. The sort of plastic handle is one issue. The slipping of the gree is another possibility when you get sort of into the 100-meter and beyond length. One way to guard against that is to use a thicker, stronger rope. The more the rope fills your brake device, the harder it's going to be for the rope to slip. In general, the sort of rope that you're going to want to use is going to be static caving rope or rescue rope, not dynamic climbing rope. It's not rated for these sort of loads, and it just won't work very well. So you can use essentially any sort of static rope you can get your hands on. The rope I use is Sterling HTP. It's a really good rope, but there are lots of other ropes on the market. So, you know, sort of use whatever you're able to come by that's reasonably affordable. In general, I think you need, depending on the length of the line, I think you need probably at least 150 feet of rope unless you want to do really sort of shorter long lines. If you're clever, you can use 150 feet of rope to do up to a 300-foot line with a 5-to-1 like this, and using a gree. So this is basically the exact setup I would build if I was on a budget. I probably wouldn't even use SMC pulleys. I would use Slackline Brothers steel pulleys if I was on a budget, in order to build a line that would be up to 300 feet long. Lastly, I also want to point out that you'll notice I've attached my brake using a separate sling that I've not tri-loaded. That's another important thing. In a little while, we'll talk about rigging plates and other ways we can attach. So the last sort of thing to cover is how we can add more mechanical advantage. Instead of just adding on pulleys side by side, we can actually multiply the advantage. And the way we're going to do that is by attaching another pulley system directly to the line coming out of the webbing side pulley. So this is an ascender. There are also handled ascenders, but this non-handled ascender is a little smaller, which is nice. You just clip a carabiner onto it. I think it might also be called a chest ascender, might be the technical term. But if you just say handleless ascender, most people will know what you're talking about. And here's a nice, you know, just single 3-inch pulley. We're just going to clip that right on here. And then we're going to take the tail as it runs out of the brake, and we're going to attach the tail through this pulley. So now we're getting this mechanical advantage multiplied by this mechanical advantage. Plus there's some mechanical advantage here, at least in theory. So roughly this is a 3-to-1 multiplying our original 5-to-1, giving us a 15-to-1 advantage. So now let me go ahead and grab my handle descender, and then you can see what that looks like. I'll step over here, clip in our handle descender, and then this is basically the full pulley system. And of course, it's not even tight enough for the gree to really grab right now. I have to sort of assist it in grabbing. But this is basically what you would do to rig a line up to 300 feet. By yourself, if you're not super strong, it's going to be a battle to get this system to rig a 300-foot line to a fairly high tension. But you can do it. I have done it myself several times. There are different types of rope attachment devices from your multiplier, besides a Petzl ascender. You might also think about using a T-block or rope man or that sort of thing. They're a little cheaper than these. I would personally advise not doing that. In my experience, they have fewer teeth to actually grab the line, and so they end up ruining your rope. And in the process, you know, you save $30, but you destroy a rope over a period of a few months. So if you're really broke and you can't afford an ascender, what I would do is just use a prussik, and you can just Google what a prussik is. But basically just buy, you know, like 20 or 24 inches of accessory cord at REI or at your local climbing shop, and then wrap that around the line and then clip into the prussik directly. And I've had friends who've had great success with prussiks. They don't ruin lines, to my knowledge. So this is a rigging plate. Actually, it's 2 rigging plates, but just ignore the fact that it's 2. You can use a single one unless you're doing crazy stuff. And for now, let's just ignore the shackle that I've got attached to the top. On the 4th hole of this rigging plate, I have attached a Petzl ID. There's also the Petzl rig, and there are a couple other sort of rescue-oriented, like the MPD rescue-oriented brakes that work really well. The MPD is sort of the nicest possible brake you can buy, but it's like $600. And the nice thing about the ID is you don't have to disconnect it to load to load your rope into it, you can just clip the piece into place like that, the cover, and then it opens right up. It's sort of hard to clip because I've got a twist shackle on here. The other option is just to use 2 steel carabiners, which sort of elongates the whole thing, but it does clip into place easier. And with these twist shackles, you got to make sure that it doesn't come open. So the nice thing about a rigging plate is it allows you to not have to use 2 slings on the tree or on whatever sort of anchor you're using. You can just use a single sling, and then everything can be attached to a main shackle. So I'm going to reconfigure this real quick so that you can see what it looks like when we use a rigging plate.
Hey, Scott.
Okay, so this is a 9-to-1 pulley system with, again, the typical 3-to-1 multiplier. Ignore the fact that it's a 9-to-1. This is just how I normally configure. If you're gonna rig anything under 100 or maybe even 150 meters, you do not need a 9-to-1 setup. I don't recommend buying it. It's quite expensive to get all the gear, and additionally, it's heavy. It requires at least twice as much rope. It's just not worth it until you're rigging in the sort of 150 or 200 meter range. I don't know if you could see when I loaded the brake, but this ID loads a lot easier than a Grigri. A Grigri 1, which is a little bit bigger, the old model, you can actually sort of poke the end of the rope down through a lot or oftentimes if you develop the skill to do that. But with the Grigri 2, it's just too small. The other brake I haven't used, but I've heard good things about is the Eddy. A friend of mine uses it and he likes it a lot. It has a metal handle, etc. Releasing the tension when things are under high tension is sort of an acquired skill. One way you can sort of protect yourself is to ultimately use a mounter hitch on another carabiner clipped into the bottom of your rigging plate. If for some reason the multiplier here isn't enough, you could put another pulley beneath all of this, just a single pulley. Like for instance, just a basic micro pulley. You could clip a micro pulley into either a separate sling, which we already have rigged, so I could just go ahead and do that now. So there's your micro pulley. And then if you had another ascender or a prussik, you could just put another multiplier on the bottom of here. So that's the beautiful part about multiplying, is you can just stack multipliers and you can get a ton of tension. I've rigged 700-foot lines by just doing a double multiplier. So it's a very, very powerful tool and doesn't require a lot of extra gear. Additionally, I've done some efficiency tests comparing the bushing cheap $15 climbing shop mini pulley versus the like $80 3-inch ball bearing SMC. And while there is a significant difference, it's not so significant that I would say you need to buy this first. So that's one of the places in which I differ from a lot of other people is they say just go ahead and invest a whole lot in the beginning. I'm more of a like, you know, buy a cheap pulley system, buy all the sort of cheap gear to begin with, because you don't know what you're gonna like in the beginning anyway, and then upgrade as you need. That's basically what I did, and I feel like it worked out nicely for me. So if it's not obvious, the benefit of the rigging plate is that you can attach all sorts of stuff to it, and then you only need one main anchor sling that can be really, really, really beefy. So you only have to buy, you know, one really good sling and one really good shackle, and then everything sort of attaches to it. And again, you only need one single rigging plate unless you're gonna do crazy tensions. These plates are rated for like 12 or 13,000 pounds, if I recall. And they make a smaller version that only has 3 holes. It's sort of like a little bear paw. So rigging plates are great for that. And they're made by SMC or a couple other companies. Basically any sort of rescue supplier tends to make them. People that do rescue rigging gear. So if you're particularly observant, you may have noticed that my line doesn't actually go from Kofi to Kofi with the rigging attached to the second Kofi. There's actually something called a line grip right in front of the second Kofi. And a line grip is, to oversimplify it, is like a big pair of pliers, basically, that grabs the line. And what this allows us to do is to soft point the line, or to remove all of the rigging after we've got it tensioned. Soft pointing is a very useful thing for specific circumstances where you need the rigging gone. Like for instance, a high line where someone's gonna be leashed into it and have to walk the whole line, and you need the leash rings to actually be able to travel over the entire width of that canyon. You can't have them stuck 8 feet out over the canyon because they can't get past the rigging. Or for a water line or other situations like that. So the line grip is a very powerful, specific tool to soft point. There are 4 other ways I know of to soft point that are less expensive but more complex to do. The line grip, you just sort of put it on and use it. The only thing to be aware of is that because there's so much tension involved, and because this is a tool that's specifically meant to be removable, it can actually detension accidentally if you don't use it exactly right. And I know several people for whom that's happened, and I don't think it's the fault of the line grip so much as just the situation. So for now, ignore the fact that the line grip is there. Don't buy one. At least don't buy one yet. You don't need it yet until you're long lining for quite a while and you're moving on to bigger and better projects where you need to soft point things. And before you get to that point, I'm gonna make a soft pointing video that covers the 5 ways to soft point, and then you can decide if spending the money for a line grip is appropriate, or if you wanna go with one of the more complicated and time consuming but cheaper ways to soft point. In general, I think the line grip is a pretty cool tool, but it's complex enough that it's gonna require its own video. Also, I should give a big shout out to Land Cruising and Jerry at Balance Community. Land Cruising especially pioneered the 9-to-1 base system that I'm using, and then Jerry has added his own little tweaks onto it. And I've based my system off of both of their designs and knowledge. All right, so this line is like 240 feet long maybe. Nowadays I mostly just estimate these things unless I'm going for some sort of record, in which case I'll actually measure it. So the first thing you have to think about is how far apart do you want your pulleys? Because remember, you're gonna need to stretch the line to a certain percentage tension. So for tubular nylon, which is what we're gonna walk today, it's gonna need to stretch at least 10, probably closer to 15%. So if it's a 200-foot line, you know, at minimum you're gonna need to pull 20 feet out of your pulleys, if not even, you know, closer to 30. So I've got a 200-foot rope in there, which is plenty of rope for what we're gonna do today, given the way I'm gonna rig it. And if this was a 5-to-1, that would be way more than enough rope. And then the first thing I'm gonna do before I use the multiplier, because of course the multiplier makes it easier, but then the trade-off is that you have to pull more times. So before I use the multiplier, I'm just gonna pull directly from the pulleys until it's starting to actually get difficult, and then I'll go ahead and use the multiplier. So with one hand I'm pulling the line taut, and with the other hand I'm feeding it through the brake. Just so that you just tug it on the tail so it comes out of the brake. And you can see one of the benefits of the 9-to-1 is I can make a lot of progress this way. With the 5-to-1, it's gonna be difficult to get it more than about 1,000 pounds of tension doing this. In a line of this length, it's gonna need closer to 2,000 pounds. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and hook up our multiplier. Goes on the tail coming out of the brake. The handleless ascender, or I guess chest ascender, goes in place. Clip in the multiplier, pulley comes off, or I'm sorry, ascender comes off. And then you can see I have to pull a lot more, 3 times as much in fact, to get the same travel. But it's not nearly as tiring. All right, once it's all tight, you take this stuff off. And the reason I've included all these shots is really just to illustrate how much you need to stretch this and how tiring it can be with the webbing that stretches a lot. On the other hand, it sort of makes up for itself when you walk the line and you get that extra stretch because it's really bouncy and fun. So bring a friend or two or make a friend or two and it'll be a lot easier for you. So the last thing I want to talk about is just, you might have noticed I have these devices, or I have this device hooked up that tells me the tension on the line. This is called a dynamometer, or sometimes people call it a crane scale. Either one is a correct term for it. The 2 you're seeing right now are the sort of inline style where the display is actually built into the tension cell, the thing that does the measuring. I also have one where the display is totally separate from the tension cell and it's connected by a 20-foot cord. So you can see it right here. And these are highly useful for making sure that you don't get your line to a dangerous level of tension, but they're also quite expensive, and you don't need them. You can use sag calculators online as a way of predicting what the tension in your line will be to make sure that it's safe. So you don't absolutely have to have one. But if you are interested in finding out some numbers like what you can pull without a multiplier and what you can pull with a multiplier and what your favorite tension is, whether you're high or low or that sort of thing. Because they are quite expensive to buy and they're fairly expensive even to rent, I'm probably going to begin renting one of mine, the one that has the blue display and the separate tension cell for a low cost to slackliners, or at least slackliners that know someone who knows me, or I'm going to kind of figure out how to do it. But since I don't want to make people put down a huge deposit. But that'll be a future video where I talk about dynos more in depth and what you can do with them and what the benefits are. All right, so thanks for joining me for part 4 of the Longline series. Hopefully you learned a lot about rigging, or at least something new, and hopefully most of what I said made sense. There's going to be one last part where we'll talk about how to walk, and anything that I didn't quite get ironed out in here, we'll try to lump that into the 5th segment. So I'll see you soon.